Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see so many faces here today. I have no introductory remarks to make other than to thank Patrick for coming today to present on Demystifying Data Use Agreement. A few of you have probably already seen this. I think you were at the SRA conference up at Mackinac, and I did make a few revisions to this, some for UN policy specifically. I unfortunately did not change my jokes, which were terrible to begin with. So you're going to be stuck hearing them again. And I'm also figuring out the clicker because it's different. So part of this is, before we get started, and I know everybody on Blue Jeans can't really raise their hand, but how many of you are here from Michigan Medicine? All right, so how many, raise your hands, are from some other component that's not dentistry? Okay. And that'll become a little bit relevant later. So what we're talking about today is everybody's working with, in some form, probably, I should ask, is anybody from a central unit like IRB or any other compliance office, other than the two people I know from ORSP? I'm sorry? Okay. So a lot of you probably already work with professors or guys that either are sharing data or getting data in some form, have some interest in this to try to figure out if and when you need to bring the PI in and say, hey, you need to get a data use agreement or something might need to happen differently, or you may not need one and they can go ahead and share data. That's what the purpose of this is trying to figure out. This is more of an introductory level. We'll eventually hopefully do some that are a little more specific and in-depth on specific regulations. We wanted to do a broad topic one, as everybody here is going to be a little bit involved in different types of regulations depending on the nature of the data you use. So some of the first questions and what we want to talk about today is, can you share the data that you're looking to share, or I suppose receive the data, which generally you can? Did the data come from human subjects? That's something that is going to make a difference to answer some of that first one. Are there regulations of some kind controlling the sharing of the data? Do you have the appropriate agreement in place to share the data, and what kind of terms are required for you to share the data? That's what this is all about, is trying to figure out when and how that works. So first thing to figure out is, what kind of data do you have? Do you have data anyhow? Now, data is broadly defined. It's everything. Anything that gives you information is data, and that's great. Doesn't necessarily mean you need an agreement to share it. There's general results data. Some of you might work in engineering or in chemistry or somewhere where you're working with compounds, you're working with animals, you're working with lasers and machines. The results you get, that's all data. You don't really need an agreement necessarily to share that data, other than a few other things we'll talk about going forward. But generally, that's not regulated by anything. That's just considered general proprietary information of some sort, or whatever that you have and wish to share with restrictions you want to impose. There's data that's derived from human subjects, and that may be people at Michigan Medicine, maybe other people. There's a lot of things done, I know, in ISR and social work, a lot of things with surveys. Anything that comes from human subjects, whether it's from clinical trials, which a lot of people think of, but also anything where you're asking questions, getting any information from human subjects, derived from records related to people. This is obviously the quick and easy one, is the medical records. People think about that. We work with census data. There are banking records and banking regulations, SEC regulations, housing records. There are special regulations for HUD-related data for housing and urban development that sometimes we get involved in. And the question is whether or not it's raw data, or is it coded or identifiable. Even if it's derived from human subjects, there's going to be a second kind of part of figuring out whether or not these regulations would apply, and you need something for sharing this data. So the first thing is whether or not you own the data. And you've probably all heard, oh, we own the data, this is my data, I own the data. How many people thought you own the data, or the PIs think they own the data? And first of all, if anybody would own any of it, it'd be the University of Michigan, not PIs. Secondly, you can't really own data per se. Data is something that it's just information. You can't tell me that I can't use the number 5. I mean, a lot of your data, even if it's derived from human subjects, is how many units, and many of you have seen in Michigan Medicine, or you ask questions from your surveys, how many times have you done this? How many different surgeries have you had? Whatever. If they say 5, you don't get to own the number 5, and nobody else ever gets to use the number 5. We've all been banned from using anything once Sesame Street taught us the number 5. So, I mean, this is a problem. You can't really do it. It's all related to copyright. How is the data organized? That's what really controls and owns the data. There's a little caveat, obviously, there's certain protections of privacy that attach that the person whose data it is, the actual human subject, has some rights to that data and to protect it. But it's the copyright. So what your PI or university would actually own is the organizational structure of that data. It's all of those elements combined in that Excel spreadsheet or that case report form or that different chart or some sort of record of data that you've created. That's really what is owned and can be owned. It's that exact nature of the data and how it's organized, what you've done with it, it's manipulated. This is the readout. This is what makes it unique to you and has some sort of inherent value that you can control. When it comes to data derived from human subjects, the questions become, as we talked about, is it identifiable data? If so, we have regulations that would apply. There's HIPAA, there's FERPA, the common rule. Those are the most common ones you've probably all heard of in some form or another. Again, we talked about other ones. There are census data that I know some of you work with, because I've worked with you on them, that have identifiers. There are the banking laws and regulations that say you can share certain account information, but you can do certain things with it. There are privacy laws. And the reason we all know that these are there and you can share some is you will have deposit agreements to get your data, or you share your data with the university. They may have to share it with somebody else sometimes to get money put into your bank account. The privacy laws, this is different than the HIPAA privacy rule you might have heard of. There's also the Privacy Act, which is a different section of the U.S. Code that governs that you have certain rights to privacy of your identifiable information or of your information, certain sensitive nature of data and information about yourself that gets protected. If it's data that doesn't have any identifiers, is it anonymized? Is it de-identified? Is it the raw results we talked about in some form? Is it aggregated in that regard? If so, then the regulations may not really apply, and we might have different ways we can share the data either with or without agreements, depending on that. Really, though, if it's anonymized or it's de-identified, it's raw results. It's back to that copyright. It's that organization of the number 5 next with the other data elements, and copyright and contractual requirements are really all that control the use of the data. And so the question becomes, do you wish to restrict or limit the use? Biggest one we always have is, do you want to say they can't share it with another third party? If you give it to another, your PI wants to give it to a collaborator, they're fine with doing that, but do they want to say, you can't go give it to other collaborators, you have to send them to me and I'll give it to them each time. I want to control who gets the data and what, for what purpose. If it's de-identified, just so you know, for everyone at Michigan Medicine, if it is de-identified, if it's of patients, policy, UMHS compliance has a policy, we still require a data use agreement to share that data. We want to protect the nature of that data. We want to protect the patients. We want to make sure that that data is not just getting out into the public without any controls and going anywhere it wants and be easily matched up with all kinds of other records. So we want to make sure we control a little bit of that. So we actually require a DUA, even though the laws, the regulations, HIPAA would not require one. University of Michigan does. So there's a little bit of a difference there. You may actually often get data from another university that doesn't require that. HIPAA doesn't require it. If they don't have a policy like we do, often you can get de-identified data, no agreement needed, nobody's breaching any regulations or laws, and so your PI gets that data. That is great. Just remember to remind your PI that doesn't mean we can do the same thing going out. We have a policy otherwise. If it's de-identified and it's not patients, it could be from medical records, but you got it from Ohio State, you got it from another university, and they didn't give you any kind of agreement or something. Or if it's common rule data, it's not from patient records, it's not of patients we treated. These are people we enroll in surveys and we ask questions, we do social work, we do different types of survey research on them. Then a DOA would not necessarily be required by regulation, but if we got that data from Ohio State, if they gave us a data use agreement, they may have a clause in there that says you can't provide it to third parties without the similar terms and conditions. So we may still need one. We need to look at how we got it. If we collected it and it's anonymized, if we got it without an agreement because they didn't have a policy, we can share it without an agreement. If we got it with an agreement, we have to look at what those terms and conditions say. So after we know what kind of data we have to figure out how can we transfer it and what does it take to transfer it. Is it identifiable in any form from any individual? So as you can see, aggregated versus aggregated. One of the things other people in ORSP will probably tell you about, we've probably talked to you about a lot, is when you say aggregated, it has a certain connotation, and we generally know what you mean, but we often hear it from a couple of different people either within University of Michigan or outside, and it has really two different purposes. Is it aggregated as in that pie chart you all see when you read an article or publication, something on CNN that says 17% of all people have too much light when they sleep, can't sleep well, whatever it is. That's aggregated data. You can't directly attribute it to an individual. There's no way to know which 17%, which 200 people said that. There'd be no way to figure that out. The other issue of where we hear aggregated is a lot of times, okay, we got data from 7 different hospitals and it's been aggregated into one giant spreadsheet of data, but it's all still individual level. But people tell us it's aggregated data. Well, it's aggregated in terms of you combine 7 forms, but it's still individually identifiable to a person, or could be. So the question that we're always trying to figure out is, do you mean aggregated like summary results? That 17%, 35% is what I have up here, have X result, or do you mean you aggregated it, but it's still at an individual patient or subject level? That can make a huge difference. If it's the second one up here, the 35%, it's completely anonymized. It's not even considered data of a human subject under the regulations, and you can share that any way you see fit, and that's why you can actually publish that pie chart that says 35% of the graph. If it's the first one, there may still be those other restrictions based on the laws and regulations that say we can't necessarily share it. Is it non-human data? Is it basic results like we talked about, the compounds, the data of mice, the laser readouts? Then the question again is, do you wish to add any of these by contract? They can't publish the actual data itself. They can publish their results. They have to give you an acknowledgement or a co-authorship. We have that requirement in a lot of our agreements. The SPI one in there. Are there basic security requirements that you want them to put in place to make sure that it's only transferred in certain ways, whether it's under encryption, things of that nature? And that's where we put that in there. These are the types of things that we would do if you don't have too many extra regulations and you want just something in place that would cover basic information of these chemicals, animals, and such. Those can actually be covered under an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. They're just confidential or proprietary information. We can also receive them that way from other entities, and we often do. So now we need to figure out, as we said, do regulations apply? First, we have the common rule that covers research of all human subjects that are identifiable information. It's either alone or it could be supplemented with other regulations. So you could have common rule that applies to how you collect data, but then it could be that you're collecting HIPAA data or FERPA data. It depends on exactly how you're collecting things. It could also just be if it's surveying people, you're just doing it under common rule. And it's a little bit of a trick. That we're always sorting through. If I have a survey out or you survey me and I tell you I have asthma, I'm not disclosing to you HIPAA data. You're not a medical provider. I'm not using this for treatment. I'm just telling you information. I tell my friends or people know this about me. That's not HIPAA data. That's just information about me. But you collected it through that survey. It's actually governed by the common rule that, it sounds like a medical condition. It's not governed under HIPAA if you're not using this to treat me and you're not a medical provider storing this in some sort of form. Regulations generally will cover identifiable data, and that's what we're talking about. This is where David's question came in. What exactly are identifiable data or de-identified? Once it's properly de-identified, then usually the regulation no longer covers the data. Examples of this: data extracted from medical records, that's governed by HIPAA. HIPAA governs the medical record data and how you would pull that data. If you would extract it in such a way that you record it without any identifiers, whether direct or indirect, it's completely de-identified under HIPAA, then the data is likely not governed by HIPAA in any way, and we wouldn't require a data use agreement, except for at University of Michigan, we would for our patients. The remaining consideration is a general concept, and the reason why I keep saying it's likely not governed by HIPAA, there is one overarching concept or issue that's always kind of in the background when we're discussing if something's de-identified. A lot of you have talked to us, we've either sent you that list or talked to you about the 18 direct identifiers that you removed to make it de-identified. There are certain concepts where if the population of people is so small, something is so rare and unique, it may still be identifiable even with basic information. Certain rare diseases that we work with that only have a couple of hundred people around the world, which means there's only possibly one or two in each state. It's too easy to know who has that disease in the state of Montana, the state of Michigan. And there's only one or two. It's too easy to re-identify them. It's the same reason where you hear one of those indirect identifiers is you can show age, you can talk about age until they become 89. Anybody over 89 you have to represent as 89 plus. That's because the population starts to dwindle over 89. There's fewer people, it becomes easier to re-identify. Also the same reason if you talk to us, we talk about, I was just doing it this morning, someone with zip codes in towns under 20,000 people. If you grew up in a small town or you've seen or heard about small towns, everybody knows everybody's business, that's fine. It's too easy to re-identify who those people are that have certain conditions and know about it. The other question about figuring out if a regulation applies is, does it apply to the entity that's actually got the data? Does it apply to us? This comes up a lot right now. How many of you have heard about GDPR from the European Union? Okay. How many of you have Twitter, Facebook, any kind of social media account? How many of you about a year ago got a bunch of emails about updates to privacy policies from those that you didn't read? Those were all telling you that now your data is regulated by GDPR. It's a new law in the European Union, came out last March. And it's something that is applicable to all data in the EU, personal data. It doesn't really apply to us on how we collect our data because we're not in the EU. We're not collecting data in the EU. It applies to us if we get data from the EU. So that becomes the question is it actually applicable to us? One of the questions here, and this becomes important even within the University of Michigan and how we send stuff out. If you have HIPAA data, all of you that said you're from Michigan Medicine, keep in mind, if you send that data without an agreement, it's HIPAA regulated data that you're sending out, you send it to a non-covered entity, HIPAA no longer attaches to that data. They have no requirements under HIPAA whatsoever to protect that data unless you pass those obligations on by contract. That's why we require these data users. They can share that data even in identifiable form and do whatever they want with it and cause all kinds of problems that really only come back on us getting sued for breaching HIPAA, providing it in the first place without that data use agreement. Again, that's why we require that data use agreement. So that becomes part of that. It works also here within the university. How many of you know that we are a hybrid entity? We have both covered entity and non-covered entity components at the University of Michigan. So if you transfer from Michigan Medicine to ISR, they are a non-covered entity. They no longer have the obligation to actually do anything under HIPAA to protect that data, arguably. There's a little bit of a nuance there with this because all of the data is actually owned by the regions of the University of Michigan to the extent we can own it. We talk about that. And we're one entity, but we do have a hybrid component. They would have less obligation to follow in terms of the HIPAA requirements for the storage and retention of all of that data than you guys do, and that's why we usually, when we work with both schools or multiple schools working with the data, and it involves Michigan Medicine data, that usually ends up being the admin home on that UFA to route the data use agreement. That's why it often is required by the University of Michigan health system, the UMHS compliance or UMMS compliance office now to kind of control that data, make sure we still have the right obligation to follow that data. For those of you that wonder on the covered entity components, that's the citation. You can look it up later if you want to and read it. It's very exhilarating. It tells you, though, about how healthcare providers, health plans, clearinghouses are what is defined as a HIPAA-covered entity. They're required to comply with that privacy rule that says you can't share that identifiable information. So when you get to the non-HIPAA-covered entity component, they're not required to. We pass that requirement to follow the privacy rule by contract. This does include self-insured companies, and I put in here just so we remember, UM is a hybrid entity. So anything under Michigan Medicine, anything that would actually treat and cover patients in any way, there's a clinic in the psychology department, I believe, that has some clinical treatment in psychology that's I think separate, that's LSNA. But if they do any clinical treatment, they would have a hybrid, be part of the covered entity component because we're treating patients. And that really becomes part of that. We're a healthcare provider. It includes mental health, physical health, physical therapy, all kinds of different things. If you're not sure, feel free to ask us or ask one of your. So HIPAA defines that DNA is not an identifier under HIPAA. I know it seems a little counterintuitive because there's all kinds of ways where you see it on all the different police shows where they're often looking at the DNA and tracking to who it was and matching it up. HIPAA is very specific that DNA is not an identifier. So in that way, it wouldn't be unless there's other data with it, the date you collected the DNA, date of service. So there's the other 18 identifiers. We often get that when we work with things. If you're sending DNA sequencing and there's other dates, if you're sending MRI scans, but you leave that date that the MRI was taken in that top corner, that becomes identifiable data. It's a limited data set. Looks like just a picture. It's a limited data set. It's the date that someone's picture was taken, their X-ray of their knee, the MRI of their skull, whatever it is, and it could be tracked back to that person on that date if they went and tried to match it up, because maybe only one person had that MRI on that date at that hospital. Now we know who it is. Also, for any of you who aren't sure, Michigan medicine, this is actually one that became a little newer to me in about the last 6 months. I was not aware of until one of the PIs told me this in a meeting, that some of those scans, the MRIs or X-rays, are actually made in such a way that you can zoom in and pull the serial number off of a pacemaker or off of an implanter device. That is an identifiable data set. And if you can scan in and see that, you can look up whose device that is through the serial number. That becomes identifiable data. So we're often told it's de-identified. Keep those things in mind. That doesn't make it de-identified. It's a limited data set. And just in case anybody's curious, you can't have a de-identified limited data set. It's de-identified from personal identifiers, but it's still identifiable in some form. It can be traced back to somebody with other information added to it under HIPAA. So other information, now we're on to FERPA. This is for people who work with anything in the Family Educational Rights Protection Act. This is something that came about in '75. There's not actually a lot of information on FERPA because it hasn't been heavily litigated. We all either apparently agree or nobody seems it's that much that we're violating under it. This actually, and we have fairly standard practices across the community in our FERPA agreements. They're fairly similar, they're standard, and all the terms are very specific in FERPA, so we often agree to the same language. It just takes a lot of time figuring out which parts of FERPA might relate. It's the educational records of an educational agency or institution or party acting on its behalf and directly related to a student. Has to be directly related to a student, has to be kept as an educational record. One thing to keep in mind, for those of you who aren't sure or aren't clear, this may be new information to you as well, for all the different schools that use FERPA data or medical data, if it's medical records of a student, FERPA has its own version of HIPAA, and that covers it, not HIPAA. If it doesn't apply to the student health centers when we treat our students, that's kept as part of their medical records, and FERPA actually governs that. When we do a transfer of student records, we're working on things with like concussion studies of students, things of that nature, that would actually be governed possibly under FERPA instead of HIPAA, depending on when and how it's collected and stored. It could be both at our campus because we have university hospitals that aren't necessarily specifically student centers, and they don't just keep them as part of the student record, they're patient record. It's a little tricky for us at Michigan, a little easier when you talk to a school down the street at Eastern Michigan that doesn't have a hospital. They are giving you medical records of their students from a student health center. It's covered under FERPA. Is the data de-identified? And we talk about this on whether or not the regulations apply. There's not a specific de-identification process of 18 identifiers under FERPA. It's more of a concept of blurring in certain information. It's very much specific to what you're actually trying to collect, how you're trying to use it. So the example I give is there's certain demographic information, grade level, school, things of this nature. By themselves, you can have the gender, you can have the grade, you can have what school they're at, you can have ethnicity. That may be de-identified FERPA data. It depends on when and how you report it. If you also add in, though, that they're 10th grade and there's only that they're Asian American, they're female, 10th grade. I went to a small school, had 8 people that graduated in my marketing major. There were 3 females. Probably becomes much easier to identify whose records they are when there's 3 people that applies to. When there's 1 that it applies to, it's now identified. identifiable. If you're doing that in Seattle and they have a large population of Asian American females in 10th grade, it may not be identified. So it's all very specific. It can be that simplistic here. Even within here, we go to certain school districts, and I work with guys all the time, and in that school district, suddenly pulling the ethnicity may be a huge factor if it's a primarily African American school and there's only one male Caucasian student or Hispanic student. It becomes something that's now quickly identifiable data, so that we have to be very cautious of how it is actually collected and reported. And it can be just reporting it based on the school, and they might make you start to do certain types of blurring. You report it in cell level sizes, you add schools, you report it by regions of the country. You can still disclose this information, same as HIPAA, without consent under certain exceptions. That's the statute. Most common ones are directory information. If we're just talking about who's on the football team, everybody can go on to MGoBlue and look up the roster of our football team. That's public information. That's pretty easy to see. That's not really a FERPA record. Each school actually has to declare what its directory information is, by the way. So if you're not sure, you can always contact our general counsel or our registrar might actually know what that is. The others are that we use the most here are the studies exception and the audit or evaluation. You're getting the data to do a study, to do an audit or evaluation of an existing program to help a school improve how it functions. So we also have to figure out, when we figure out if it's identifiable, is it human subjects and are we doing research? It's a two-part question, really. Each regulation defines what's identifiable. We just kind of went over a little bit of that. HIPAA, FERPA, is it de-identified or anonymized? I say it that way. There's anonymized is kind of the GDPR implication. It's also the common rule. There's no such thing really technically as de-identified common rule data. There is de-identified data under HIPAA. Under the common rule, if there's a code attached to it and the key still exists, it's coded data. That is a form of identifiable data. It'd be a little more akin to a really watered down version of a limited data set, but someone can track it back with that key and know who those people are. We often can handle that with one clause that just says you won't ask for the key and we won't provide it to you. And that makes it pretty simple, but it is actually an identifiable data set, and it does require a data use agreement that says that in some form, generally. Anonymized would be if the key is destroyed or the code is stripped off of it, so nobody would have that code, couldn't re-identify who they are. So that's kind of the concept here. Under the common rule, it is identifiable. It is human subjects unless the key is destroyed. That's anonymized. FERPA, the identification we talked about, this is actually their standard from the Department of Education. It's considered successful when there's no reasonable basis to believe that it can be, the remaining information can be used to identify an individual. Reasonable basis, that's just reasonable people differ, and there's not a lot of litigation on that, but that's where we talk about kind of the blurring. Does it seem to be a little intuitive that it's easy to identify, then we may want to do a little more blurring or treat it as identifiable FERPA data. There's nothing wrong with doing the agreement. You're not completely sure. The other question is it research? If it's not human subjects or it's not research, this is where it's a little bit different, especially if you're working in doing surveys or medical records. Either way, it may not mean that you don't need informed consent on the subject. You may, if you're collecting it from them directly for a quality assurance program project type of thing, but you still would need an agreement there. So if you're transferring identifiable patient data, but it's not really about trying to cure kidney cancer, you're trying to find out why a certain hospital can't diagnose people properly with kidney cancer until they're 3 stages beyond every other hospital that diagnoses them in the same region. You're auditing that program. It's a quality assurance. A lot of you have worked in quality assurance, QA/QI, you hear it with UMMS clients. You're trying to figure out why a project is, or a program or a process doesn't function properly. You're trying to audit, does that program work in that school system? Does it work in software, something of that nature? You're really not concerned with the data itself. You're not trying to cure or research the data to cure what the underlying causes of the data. You still need an agreement that controls the data, but you don't necessarily need informed consent. You may or may not need IRB approval. The difference here is, are you collecting the data directly? So if you're collecting it from medical records and you're providing identifiable data for QA/QI, that doesn't actually require IRB approval. They don't approve because you're not researching the human subject, you're doing research on something else. It does require the data use agreement, and those actually go through, if it's our data going out, goes through UMMS compliance Jamie Strickland's office, as those agreements, not ORSP. You may still need consent. That's if you're collecting the data specifically and directly, getting consent authorizations, but you're going to transfer that data after the direct interaction with the subject. You're going to transfer that out for quality assurance purposes, not research on that. You may still have to do the consent. We have some of these that go on. IRB may not actually review that consent. It's really between the parties to actually just give the consent. You can transfer data without a consent. That's not a problem. We can do it in a lot of different cases here. We just have to figure out, this is why we go through these first couple of steps in these slides. The first part of this presentation is to figure out what regulations apply. Do they apply, so we know what we need to do or when we want to transfer something without consent. In HIPAA, you can transfer a limited data set without consent if you have an IRB approval or determination and an agreement between the entities. And there's certain terms, there's a list of terms in HIPAA that are required in those agreements. They're fairly standard. We see them all in every agreement. That part of the agreement is usually quick and easy to negotiate. It's the other 8 pages we might get from another entities. Ours is 1 page. The FDP now has a version as well that's trying to streamline some of those negotiations. One of the required terms is no more than the minimum amount of limited data you need to do that project. Don't collect extra just because you think it might be helpful. You're supposed to use the minimum amount that you need and no more. If it's de-identified, it's not regulated. Again, no agreement, no consent. we require the agreement. QA, QI, we talked about that. FERPA, there's the several exceptions. There's directory information studies, audit and evaluation, school official exception. Or if it's just actually de-identified, then you don't consent. All of these, except for really de-identified, require some sort of an agreement put in place, and some of that might be with deliverables. We'll talk about that in a second. And GDPR, those require agreements as well. There's actually a bunch of different agreements, and we're going to talk about that briefly a little bit later, and how we're working with GDPR, which is still kind of an ongoing process. So now we get into what type of agreement do we use. Data use agreements is the most common you've heard of. These control terms and restrictions for data in general for the different regulations. Generally, they include standard terms. We don't transfer any rights to the data other than what we tell you you can use it for this specific purpose. That's why a lot of PIs want to say, you can't give it to other people, make them come get it from me so I can control what, when, how, and what data is being used. Use appropriate safeguards, don't transfer to other parties. If we give you permission to, they basically have to sign the same agreement. Report unauthorized use or disclosures, don't attempt to re-identify, return and destroy when you're done. Data transfer, this is actually for identifiable, basically full PHI under HIPAA, or other full PII, what it's called, personally identifiable information. You see that term? I mean, a little caveat here, all PII, or all PHI is PII, not all PII is PHI. Anything that's personally identifiable information is PII. That's everything that's identifiable. That's what GDPR is trying to put under one regulation. That's what's used for the identifiable versions under FERPA and the common rule. But since it's health information under HIPAA, they call it protected health information, which is just a form of PII. Data transfer agreements would be done for those types of things for research. The important part up there is for research purposes. You're getting a business associate agreement that's different. It might need be that it's supposed to be a data transfer agreement, and when you route it to us, that's what we tell them, and we refuse to sign the business associate agreement. We work out a different agreement with them. So the terms that is the same as the data use agreement. We also require, or usually have to require certain other ones, minimum amount of data necessary to follow high-tech or NIST destruction requirements. The use in context, so it's a little different than you don't attempt to re-identify. They're already identifiable. You can't identify afterwards if you have my name and the information. You already know who I am. You just say you can't harass me unless I've given you permission, my authorization or consent. And if you're hearing the different words, by the way, under HIPAA, it's an authorization. Under everything else, like common rule, it's a consent. Just different terms under the different regulations. You might have to notify Department of Health and Human Services, the Secretary, for breaches, and you probably need IRB determination prior to use, probably QA, QI. The other kind is the business associate agreement. So we do have those. This is if a covered entity engages a business associate to carry out one of its healthcare activities on its behalf. It's to provide a service for that covered entity. Something that basically they're passing on the privacy and security rule. The biggest and most important thing is receiving and transferring full PHI under HIPAA for a service. If you have a business associate agreement that someone gave you, and it's not for a service or it's not full PHI, it's not the right agreement. Again, you can route those UFAs to ORSP and we're going to tell them. And we won't sign it. We also don't give them a BAA when it's not for those certain types of projects. One of the big examples we have is if a covered entity, UM does this sometimes with certain types of labs or other things. If we're engaging somebody else, say, to do billing, collect billing information, or collect payments for our services, we send it to a third party. We have to give them the name and address to send the bill, the phone number that came from the medical record. That's how we have it. That's HIPAA data. That's full PHI under HIPAA. We're giving it to them. They're not researching it. They're just going after the money that they owe us, getting it paid. That's a service. That's a business associate agreement that covers that relationship. It makes them effectively the covered entity. They step into all the obligations we would normally have as the healthcare provider. And they also step into all the liabilities that come with it that are ordered by statute. A lot of them are automated. All the things like you've seen when the Equifax breach, how many of you remember Equifax got hacked? They offered LifeLock to everybody who got hacked for like 6 months. You could sign up, you get protection for a year. That's pretty much a requirement to protect and mitigate damages. We do that by contract, so that becomes that business associate's requirement and not ours if that information gets hacked from them when they're trying to collect billing. We'd rather they pay for LifeLock for a year than us when it's their problem that they couldn't maintain their data or our data. It's not for research projects. Again, that's when we would use a data transfer. So FERPA additions, it's basically the same type of agreement. Different things with FERPA, they're actually required by statute to be time limited. They have to have an end date. FERPA, it can be extended, but it's required by statute to have an end date. It can't just say you get to keep the data for so long as you're doing the project. You have to give a reasonable time frame of how long you want to do that project. If it's longitudinal, it could be that you're going to do it for 20 years and that's how long it lasts. Doing a longitudinal study and justify that. You must destroy the information when no longer needed. It's not you return or destroy necessarily. You can be asked to return it, I suppose, but there has to be some information. You have to not keep any copies of it for purposes. That's a requirement of FERPA. You must be provided to someone who's authorized to receive it, whom it can be shared. It must be stated. All of that information. Who can have it? Who can have it? Who can you share it to? Has to be shared in the or stated in the agreement. If it's not, you decide you want to add a collaborator later. You, especially from another school, you got to amend the agreement before you can provide. And it must state the purposes. It's going to be things of the study and audit evaluation. This is kind of why. The purpose is we're evaluating this program. We're going to find out just by how to improve your math programs here for this specific school, which means we're probably going to have to have a deliverable or a report because it's hard to say we're improving your math program if we don't tell you what's wrong with your math program after we use your data. That makes it kind of hard to justify that we met the actual exception. There's also this one, you might see this. This is something for everybody to make sure they're aware of. It may require that we keep a log of the all copies of the data that's shared, who it's shared to. This is actually a requirement of FERPA to be provided every year to the students and their parents. That's an obligation of the school system generally. Under certain exceptions, that obligation becomes the University of Michigan. We do have those agreements, and it's up to the project team. Someone from the project team, that's up to you guys. I don't know if that's you, the PI, a grad student researcher, someone has to keep that log and provide it. We often have to do that with the Department of Health, or the Michigan Department of Education when we work with them. So the other issues we're talking about here are GDPR issues. This, again, is applicable to information that's collected and processed in the EU, or processed in the EU, or data that's accessed from the EU. One of the examples we have here, you guys remember Mo Wagner, a famous basketball player. We went to the Final Four. He's from Germany. His information, when it's here, it's collected here as a student here. That is not governed under GDPR. When he goes back to Germany and wants to get a transcript to go to grad school, that information becomes GDPR regulated. He starts accessing his information from there. Some of this might be, there's questions that we have on this. Does it actually cover when your PI goes to France for a conference and starts accessing your data when they're sitting out there on the beach for a year on a sabbatical and accessing your data? Does that now make all of our data GDPR required? Still sorting through some of that, how to do it. We talk about there's different types of agreements. There's a lot of them under GDPR. We have templates for all of these. We first have to figure out if we're a controller, we're a processor, and who we're working with, and what are they. There's controller-processor agreements, controller-controller agreements, processor-sub-processor agreements. There's actually joint controller agreements, joint processor agreements. So that you know, a controller controls the type of data that's being collected. If you drafted the protocol, you are in charge of what's collected, why, how it's used. How it's used, but you don't know what's collected. You might be the coordinating center, but you didn't draft the protocol. Somebody else says what's collected. You're the one actually doing all the research, the manipulation of the data. You might be a controller. Again, if it's GDPR data, if all the data came from universities in the US, they all collected it in the US, this isn't GDPR regulated. What we fight now, and a lot of you may be seeing and wondering what's holding up some of the agreements, a lot of the drug companies have an EU presence for pharmacy, for clinical trials, for research projects. Merck's global headquarters, Germany, they now have a GDPR clause that's ridiculous in every agreement and is unacceptable to the university in almost every situation we've run across so far, because we're almost never getting data from Merck, we're giving data to Merck. It doesn't apply to us in that case. Processor, this is what they're trying to say. We're collecting, manipulating, and providing data on their behalf. They told us what to collect. They're a controller. We're doing it on their behalf. We're a processor. We have to comply. True if we're collecting it in the EU. If we're doing the project in the EU, which we do, some of them, then this would be true. If we're collecting them all of UN patients here that we're enrolling here in Ann Arbor, we're collecting them here in Ann Arbor, HIPAA applies. We have to follow HIPAA. We have laws in the US to follow. They have their laws to follow. So we have to try to harmonize those agreements. And that's what we're usually seeing here. If we're not receiving data, you're probably not subject to GDPR. There's a little bit of a caveat if you're working with certain projects where you're actually collecting the data in the EU. If you're accessing the data from the EU, or you're collecting it from EU residents while in the US, that's governed under HIPAA. We feel confident with that. That if you have somebody here, they're an EU resident, they're not a permanent citizen or resident of the US, not a green card holder, they're still EU. They're here, they enroll in the trial, that's governed under HIPAA. They move back to the EU and want to access their data and enforce some of their rights. GDPR will allow them to do so because they're an EU person, a resident, so it may apply then. There are certain schools you might work with that have an EU campus. So they may actually be subject to GDPR. It's a little different than us. We don't have any presence that way. The other question or issue we have with this, so that you know you're probably going to always need agreement for right now, this is the question, is anything ever anonymized under GDPR? The standard is it must be impossible to re-identify given the nature and scope of all data available to the world at large. That's the standard for anonymization under GDPR. We're not real sure if anything's ever going to be anonymized. In the first year plus of this, nothing's actually been brought as far as a case. We're waiting to see if anybody gets sued for anonymized data and find out if the EU courts will ever issue any kind of direction on what this definition really means, because there's a lot of information out there. So the other option sometimes to change the nature of your data so it may not necessarily need that agreement. If it's not from UN patients, might make a difference again on the UN policy or what type of agreement, how difficult it is, or if you need one coming in. You want to get data, it's quicker and easier to be identified than if it's a limited data set and they can just send you the data. Is it possible to be more inclusive in consents, that you can notify the people, it's their data, that you're going to do certain things with the data, and that we can just kind of have an agreement, a quick and benign agreement that we can just do what the consent says we can do, basically. Can we provide the data in a more restrictive way? Do we need to provide the dates? A lot of the times we run into protocols, they want the date of admission, the date of discharge. They're trying to find out how long was it between relapse in that condition. Can we just give them the date, the duration instead? Can we tell them it was 65 days between relapse? Now it's not a limited data set, it's de-identified. We're not giving the dates of admission, dates of discharge. It can go both ways. If you just need duration, make them do the math for you and transfer it that way. It's de-identified. If they don't require an agreement, they can just start sending you the data. You don't have to wait for an agreement. So the questions could be, we try to push that through, sometimes only use the limited data set that's required by the computer programs. And some of it is evaluating with the heads of institutions what's most important. A lot of you have heard being run, there's the new data and biospecimen committee on what we do and don't share as far as our data, and whether or not it goes to for-profit companies versus other universities for certain types of research. That came out smaller than I intended. Everybody can read that, right? Oh. So a summary, what does this all mean? It's a lot of information we threw together at you, and that's unfortunate because I said this is the broad overview class or presentation that just gives kind of high point issues. This isn't really as in-depth as what each topic would go into if we did one on each topic. It also covered multiple regulations. The question is really, how did we get the data? Is it from UM patient records, UM policy, we require an agreement? Is it from a project that we collected it directly, or that we got it from another entity? Either one of those might be, did we have an agreement? If you got it in a funding project and you collected it directly, what does your funding agreement say? Some of those funding agreements say you have to give certain versions of the data to that funding entity, and you cannot give that same version to anybody else. You can only get the identified versions of it. You may not be able to give any of it. A lot of our clinical trials, we actually don't retain ownership of that data in certain forms, depending on the nature of how the data is collected, whose protocol. If we got it from somebody else, if we have an agreement that says you can't give it to somebody else, even without an agreement, or with an agreement, you might need consent. You might not just not be able to give it to someone else. Do you have data covered under a regulation? So if you didn't get it under any of those types of restrictions by agreement, is it restricted by regulation? Is it regular results? We talk about lasers, things of that nature. Is it aggregated into a summary of results versus individual level data? Might be HIPAA data, but once it's aggregated into that pie chart kind of format that you read all the time in magazines, that's okay to share without an agreement. And we often tell PIs that you can provide, if it's aggregated, that's not under the UM policy. If it's completely aggregated and it's not individual level, UMMS does not require that we have an agreement for that. That's just sharing results. We want you to publish results. That's the purpose of the university. So if you want to send that to other people as well, have at it. And if it's anonymized under the common rule, we don't require one. The policy doesn't cover that because it's not patients. So then the only question is, do you want to put those extra restrictions on it? If not, have at it. Share it without the agreement. We don't require it. We tell PIs that all the time. A lot of times they want a restriction, and we'll do the agreement. Is it identifiable in any form? If not, see number one, do we have an agreement that restricts it or that policy? If it was identifiable, was it collected with consent or authorization? And does that allow further transfer? If your consent says you won't transfer any identifiable information, you can't transfer identifiable information, then based on that nature, you would go back to, if you transferred under a different exception, maybe to consent. But otherwise, you need to know, does it say it, or can you, which is the next point, can you transfer it without that consent? Have you received your IRB review? It may be required. If you're not sure, ask IRB. If you call us, we're going to tell you ask IRB. Regulations say IRB is actually the one that required to determine if IRB needs to review. It's a little circular. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I get that, but that's their expertise and their purview is whether or not it needs it. If we're not sure, we tell you contact IRB and get them to say that they don't need to review it. We ask you to do that because we're not sure, and that's their expertise. And then use the correct agreement, non-disclosure agreement, data use, data transfer, business associate, again, for services only, some other type of agreement, or GDPR or something. And do we need to include any regulations or required terms or terms from the funding agreement as well? So, for those of you who are interested, there is a copy of FDP. I have the links up here. The FDP, I'm on the working group that helped draft the template agreements for data transfer and use. It's actually called the DTUA, so you can use it for all the different versions. There is the identified, a limited data set, other, which we use for certain types of PII. I think we're still working on FERPA and full PHI. Also on one that's trying to update the subaward agreement that a lot of you see from FDP. When it says we're transferring under the subawarded data terms applied, we're working on revising that so we can include some of those data terms right then, so you don't have to execute a separate data use agreement just to carry out the project that's already been agreed to. There's government guidance sites from HHS, Department of Education. These are the citations. If you really want to read the citation, feel free. There's 15 different versions of the common rule. I guess it's now 14 versions of the common rule. So when we talk about the common rule, that's sometimes what takes a little while to parse it out. We might have to refer to which common rule and how they do it, like you guys do on a lot of your other federal flowdown, GDPR. A lot of issues with that we still work through. That's my information. If you have questions, of course, or also Maggie and Eric do data use agreements in our office, you can contact them. Does anybody have any questions? So the question is, if you send a UFA and mark the wrong kind of agreement, can you just change it like we would in Pepper? Do you have to cancel it, reroute the agreement? We would just change it because the UFA, are you talking about if you name it something other than a data use agreement, or if you request a limited data set versus, yeah. So some of okay. So if you identify you request, or they provided a BAA, or you requested an agreement saying it's limited data set, it's not. We can just correct that information. If you route it as like a non-disclosure agreement, we'll probably kick it back and say route it as a data use because there's a bunch of extra questions on there that help us get information to use for the agreement. But we can just update the agreement because it really only offers data use agreement, and then it offers incoming or outgoing. If it's both, if we're sharing data and getting data from the external entity so that we can collaborate, combine the data, that should always be marked as outgoing. We care more about our data being protected than we do about their data coming in. That's up to them to tell us how they want it protected. So we can just change the nature and get the right agreement added into it. That's a lot of what we actually do, is fight the other entity saying they gave us the wrong agreement, or we reach out and tell the PI who said it's de-identified, did you know you're getting identifiers? Because they say it's a limited data set coming in. And sometimes then the PIs had a long discussion, and a couple of weeks later we get different agreement depending on the nature of the project. So the question is, do we only need these agreements for external as opposed to department for department? ORSP is only involved when it's external. We can't sign an agreement with ourselves. It's a legal nullity. But there's a lot of times where the departments will enter into kind of an MOU with each other saying, hey, just so you're aware, this is the nature of the data and how you need to protect it because it's sensitive. We see that a lot with certain types of, especially very sensitive data, just because the people that have the data are aware of the requirements, and someone that they're giving it to may not be aware of what exactly is required by that specific data. If you don't work with medical data, you don't work with census data. So they might put together a small MOU, and you guys are welcome to negotiate that between yourselves of what you will and won't do and sign. So the question is, to get support from ORSP, is it better to reach out in advance or do certain types of steps? One thing is, if you have an agreement, the best thing to do is route the UFA with the agreement. We can start asking a lot of questions. We can't really review anything without the IRB approvals or determinations. If they tell us it doesn't get approved, is one thing. Part of the reason why is we have seen instances where the IRB, in discussions with the PI, keeps rejecting things or sending it back for revisions. Turns out, once they finalize the consent, the nature of the project has changed. What kind of data we're going to be allowed to share has changed. And we don't want to negotiate a data use agreement or a data transfer agreement for full PHI and then find out the IRB won't let us share a limited data set. And we have to start all over as a different agreement. So that's the first thing, is if you have the agreement, send it. If you're not sure, you're looking at setting up a large type of consortium or collaboration project, you're going to try to get data from 15, 20 sites that you need to use for some reason, kind of doing your own coordinating center activity, but not really sharing it out and just collecting it. You're not going to keep it to set up a repository. Contact us. It might be good to send an email. We can usually set up a quick call for like 15, 20 minutes, get an idea what the project is, and then tell you the best way to proceed. If it's all de-identified data and they're willing to give it to you, we say just collect the data, have at it. If it requires something else, we'll often try to work with the PI to draft it. I'm just setting one for tomorrow to draft a template agreement because we need to get it from about 13 different sites. We want those agreements to match up. Usually the agreement we, as standard in the industry, is controlled, whoever's sending the agreement or sending the data usually controls the agreement for the most part. It's their requirement under most of these regulations to impute all of these obligations. Again, they're covered entities sending to a non-covered entity. They're required to impute those obligations of a covered entity on privacy rule, security rule, whatever, by contract. If we happen to, at Michigan Medicine, receive that data, we're still a covered entity. We would have to treat it as such, even if we don't have the agreement. But if you got it at a non-covered entity, you don't. So it's on them. The only thing that changes that, multi-site types of trials, usually then the direct coordinating center kind of controls the agreement, and they all the agreements to match up so they can do what they do.
Patrick, I have a question
Okay.
from a participant. We have a site where we plan to use our research staff for a research study. I am told we will need an MOU. How or who will I reach out to? And we will be using the site only for logistic base and no other reason.
Okay. So I might be a little confused on some of this. So it says that we're using our employees at another location to collect data.
We have a site where we plan to use our research staff for a research study.
Okay. So if that site's requiring some sort of an MOU for us to show up and collect that data, they can pass that MOU on to us. That actually gets a little tricky. Usually one of us that does data use would be involved. We may not do the whole agreement. It depends on if it also requires a lot of other collaboration terms, if we're collaborating with that site or not. If it's purely about transfer of data while we're on that site or what data we may access, it would go to the data use team and we would negotiate that. Otherwise, we're involved in it because we have some of those where they try to put in a lot of extra and inappropriate terms and we usually fight them, especially if we're collecting the data. It's our data even though it's on their site. And they try to claim it's their data when it's on their site. We're consenting them. We're collecting the data. These are our subjects. It's our data. We're liable under the consent for certain things. We're going to control that data and how it's used, and we're going to fight back up and say, we did it at your location. Doesn't make it your data. If you have other questions on that, you may want to email or call me, because that may involve a lot more follow-up on that. Anything else?
So I want to just, before we quit, I want to make sure everyone knows who Maggie and Eric are. So Maggie and Eric, could you just wave or, yeah, thank you. So, and if we get a round of applause for Patrick.
Thank you, Steve.